Professor Soames is a professor of philosophy at the University of California. He has also held teaching positions at Yale and Princeton. His undergraduate work was at the former, and his graduate to PhD was at MIT. He specializes in the philosophy of language and the history of the analytic philosophy, and some of his books include Understanding Truth, that's Oxford University Press, Beyond Rigidity, Oxford University Press again, Reference and Description, that's Princeton, Rethinking Language, Mind and Meaning, Princeton. It goes on and on and on. So as I said, I'm really, really happy to have you speaking with us, Professor Soames. The first question I wanted to ask you, what was the impact of Tarski's concept of truth in formalized languages?
Okay, well, let's start out with the most obvious. It had an impact in mathematics and metamathematics, of course. Tarski was interested in the notion of definability within different sorts of mathematical theories, and he realized, of course, that definability is closely connected to the notion of truth. And he also realized that truth was a source of semantic paradoxes, and so he wanted to establish for mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics that we can employ a notion of truth in formalized languages and demonstrate that it's free of semantic paradoxes. And so that's what motivated him, and his definition did convince him and others that this is so, and that was an important feature in sort of winning the acceptance of the Gödel-Tarski theorem of the arithmetical indefinability of arithmetical truth. And then the other impact, which I think was quite important, was it provided the basis for the slightly later definition of truth in a model, which in turn became the standard notion used to characterize logical properties and relations. That's pretty straightforward. Now, in philosophy proper, the situation's a little more complicated, I think. First, I guess, he convinced a group of important philosophers who had previously been inclined to dismiss truth as an illegitimate pseudo-notion, perhaps even a metaphysical notion, convinced them that, in fact, it's perfectly coherent and semantically useful. So after the Tractatus, which basically treats truth as something which tries to state the relationship between propositions and the world to be really a pseudo-notion, Carnap, in his early days, before he was convinced by Tarski, shared that idea, and Carl Hempel wrote, of course, a famous article on the logical positivists' theory of truth in 1934, in which he adopted a sort of version of the coherence theory of truth because he thought anything else would be illegitimate. Now, of course, after Tarski's famous paper, Carnap was a very quick and a very enthusiastic convert, and he came to see or to believe that truth was a very useful notion, and in fact it became his central semantic notion when he wrote Introduction to Semantics in 1944, and then it's used again in a very similar way in Meaning and Necessity in 1947. And even as late as 1967, when Donald Davidson's Truth and Meaning article appeared, he made the claim in the article that the key notion for his theories of truth as theories of meaning, the key notion of truth was Tarski's notion of truth, and that became, for him, the central semantic notion in constructing a theory. Now, those are matters of historical influence. But there were problems, and I guess one of the chief problems, which eventually came to be realized, was that Tarski's notion of truth, though it was called the semantic notion of truth, if we're really strict about the way Tarski understood it, his truth predicates, his defined truth predicates, the truth predicates that were defined in the meta-language using no semantic primitives, were really not semantic at all. Attributions of truth conditions to sentences using those defined notions actually provide not one shred of information about meaning. So, of course, there's no way they could be central to a theory of meaning. Now, as I say, at a certain point, that became clear, but it took decades for it to become clear, with the exception of at least one philosopher, Alonzo Church, in the early 40s, characterized Tarski's definition in the way that I've just indicated. He was right about that, but it wasn't a central point for Church, and so it wasn't picked up by other people. But, of course, now, if we look at it a little more broadly, what Tarski did was show that we could define using no semantic primitives at all. We could define in a meta-language that contained the object language and that had a little bit of set theory in it and syntax for the object language. He defined a notion that was provably coextensive over that object language with our ordinary notion of truth. And of course, since the object language wasn't going to have any liar paradoxical sentences in it, we were not going to run into trouble on that score. So once you see that, then the next thing to do is say, look, I'm going to construct a theory of truth conditions for the sentences in some language, and I'm going to use a meta-language, and I'm going to use the ordinary notion of sentential truth, not a defined notion, but I will simply substitute that into a theory which has precisely the form of Tarski's theory and allows you to derive the same biconditional T-sentences as the Tarski theory would allow you to derive. And from that, you can indeed extract some semantic information. Now, that's an advance, that's good, but the amount of information about the sentences of the language that you're able to extract is really pretty impoverished. It's not zero, but it's pretty impoverished. Not nearly enough to function as a real theory of meaning. And so something further was needed, and once we had the development of possible world semantics and different variations on the theme of intentional logics or intentional semantics, then what we get are theories which are still kind of broadly Tarskian in that you can compositionally assign truth conditions to sentences of the object language, but in this case they're going to be statements to the effect that the sentence as used in a particular context is true at a possible world state considered as a place of evaluation, if and only if at that world state, so such and such, whatever it may be that give the truth conditions. That gives you considerably more information about meaning, and if you do it thoroughly enough, you can extract information about truth conditions that gives you information about meaning up to necessary equivalence, but not beyond that. And necessary equivalence is good, but meaning is much more finely grained than that, so it still remains incomplete. So all of these things are descendants of Tarski's definition. And in this whole process, there's been considerable progress, but it's been difficult and it's been fraught with confusions at just about every step of the way.
Yeah. Absolutely brilliant. Do you think Tarski's T-schema is best read as a theory of correspondence or as a deflationist theory?
Well, we've got to massage this a little bit.
Yeah.
The T-schema is just that. It's a schema. The sentence S is a truth in language L if and only if P, and we're going to take the instances of that schema to result from replacing the letter S on the left-hand side of the biconditional with some sentences in the object language, and we're going to replace the letter P on the right-hand side of the biconditional by S itself, if S is also a member of the meta-language, or with a paraphrase of S if it's not. So it's just a collection of those biconditionals. And so why do those biconditionals play an important role for Tarski? See, the biconditionals by themselves, just that bare, perhaps infinite class of biconditionals, well, I don't think they're either a correspondence theory or a deflationary theory all by themselves.
Yeah.
We have to think a little bit more about how they're being used. And in the case of Tarski, what was the idea? The idea was that he's going to construct a definition in the meta-language for some formal language, object language. And he'll introduce a predicate. Let's just call it T, so we're not begging any questions. And then he has a natural question that he asks. How do I know that this predicate T that I've defined is indeed or the truth predicate for the object language in question? And his answer to that, at least a substantial part of his answer to that, was that, well, I'm going to require that my definition be what he calls materially adequate. And what's that? Well, that means that from the definition, we should be able to derive an instance of schema T, where an instance is what I've defined it to be, an instance of schema T for each sentence of the object language. Okay, let's suppose you've constructed a definition. Let's suppose that you've been able to show that it's materially adequate. Now, Tarski's going to say, oh, well, you know what? My predicate T applies to the sentences of the object language if and only if those are truths of the object language. And why is he going to say that? Well, he's going to say that because he's taking something for granted. What he's taking for granted is that our ordinary notion of truth is such that if you have S and you have the claim that S is true and you form the biconditional, that's an obvious, trivial truth. It's simply central to our notion of truth, Tarski thinks, that we can get from S to the claim that S is true. And conversely, that's just what truth is. And since we can derive one of those instances for his predicate T for each sentence of the object language, we then further derive S is T if and only if S is true. And what does this show? This shows that the notion Tarski has defined is coextensive with the ordinary notion of truth over the object language in question. Now, even there, you say, well, okay, is this a correspondence theory of truth, or is this a deflationary theory of truth? Well, Tarski and Carnap convinced themselves that these materially adequate truth definitions, Tarski called them Tarski truth definitions, gave us predicates that we could apply to the object language that were not merely coextensive with the notion of truth, but they actually captured the essence of the notion of truth. And why would that be? Well, there's sort of two sides to this. On the one side, Tarski's thinking, oh, look, I've derived, as a logical consequence, S is T if and only if P for each sentence of the object language. Okay. What have I derived it from? I've derived it from a stipulative definition. Okay. So what that basically means, we can put it this way at least, if we take stipulative definitions to be trivial or a priori or something like that, or necessary, or all of them, then each one of those biconditionals that get derived, which are consequences of the definition, have that same status as well. And so now if we look at it from the other side about truth, the ordinary notion of truth, Tarski and Carnap were, I think, mesmerized by a certain thing. Suppose I have the sentence, snow is white, is true if and only if snow is white. Now they're thinking, well, look, anybody who understands that sentence, just barely understanding it, I mean, it's just completely obvious it must be true. I mean, isn't that what it is to understand what truth is? To know that you can go from one to the other without having to do any empirical investigation or anything further? And I think they're thinking to themselves, yeah. And notice that they would say, captured that with our predicate T, given that we've established material adequacy of the definition. But that's an illusion. The illusion can be put this way. When you take Tarski's definition T, seriously, you can replace T in any meta-language sentence in which it occurs with the definition of T. And when you do that in the biconditionals that you've derived, then let's suppose snow is white is the object language sentence. Then you get something which is logically equivalent to snow is white if and only if snow is white. Okay, snow is white if and only if snow is white. That gives you no information whatsoever about meaning.
Yeah.
But if we have the sentence, quote, snow is white, unquote, is true if and only if snow is white, well, that gives you some information about the meaning of that sentence. It tells you that it doesn't mean that snow isn't white, because that would lead you to a contradiction. So this sense that they captured the relationship between a truth bearer and the claim that that truth bearer is true in the formal definition is simply false. They haven't. And the reason they haven't, and this finally gets to your question, is that sentential truth is not deflationary. To get from S to S is true or S is true to S, you need some substantial information about meaning, and it's substantial in part because it's empirical. What sentences mean is simply an empirical fact about how they're used in given communities that employ these things. And so we don't get any genuine deflationary theory of truth for sentences out of Tarski. However, I don't think that's the whole story. I think something else is significant. Let's take a big step. Let's talk not about sentences, but about what sentences are used to say. So the idea is that uses of sentences state things like that the earth is round, that snow is white, that 2 + 3 = 29, whatever might be. These things that uses of sentences state are things that, yes, they're stated, they're asserted, they're believed, they're disbelieved, they're known. And then we ask the question, in all these cases, it seems like there's someone doing the stating or believing or knowing, and then there's what was stated, believed, or known. And this gives us the feeling that these are relational notions, and in each case they relate agents to contents of some sort. And the contents themselves are not the sentences which are used. They're something which gives the content of those uses, and those are things that are assessed for truth or falsehood. And if you ask about those things, they have a name in philosophy, though people have often not been able to figure out exactly what they are. And the name in philosophy is proposition. And if you ask about a theory of truth for propositions, and you try to test the deflationary idea that the inference from a truth bearer to the claim that it's true, and conversely, is, let's say, trivial, a priori, necessary, all of them, then there's a sense, maybe that's really so. Maybe that's really right.
Yeah.
And if you do have that feeling, then you think that truth is deflationary, that's the key fact about it, or some variation of that is the key fact about it. And you don't have to mention anything else about facts or anything further. There may be such facts, but it's not part of the theory of truth. Then you're on the verge of a deflationary theory of propositional truth. Now, if you look at Tarski had a deflationary idea about truth, but he didn't have any clue about the difference between sentences and their contents or propositions. And Carnap really was pretty much, I think, in the same boat. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of trying to answer your question.
Yes, yeah. But it was a history lesson, but I really enjoyed it. It kind of brings us really well onto the next question. What was/is the impact of Quine's indeterminacy of reference on any possible truth theory?
Okay, this is a somewhat complicated answer too, I think, and I want to put it into some historical context. So let me begin by just saying something about the way I understand Quine's indeterminacy of translation theses and inscrutability of reference theses. I see them as leading to Illuminativism about the ordinary pre-theoretic, pre-scientific conceptions we might have about meaning and reference, and including the idea of a predicate, like the predicate is a rabbit, referring to something or applying to something or being true of something. All of these things, I believe, are called into question by Quine's two theses and the way he argues for the two theses. And that's calling quite a bit into question. And if you just take the last example, the notion being true of an object, it's very, if you go as far as to eliminate that, you're on the verge of eliminating truth itself as it's ordinarily understood. Certainly of propositions, because that's not going to be, they're going to be gone as well, but maybe of ordinary sentences too. And if you're going to eliminate all those things, which I think Quine really does, and I think you can see a progression from word and object to ontological relativity, and then 15 or so years later or more, 20 years later, you get In Pursuit of Truth, and he kind of makes clear what's going on. We started out in word and object replacing ordinary meaning with stimulus meaning, and we end up, when we get to the end, with ontological relativity and In Pursuit of Truth, replacing ordinary reference to whole enduring rabbits or whatever you have, to disquotational Tarski reference, which just says if you've got a given language, that then you've got a finite number of terms, and you say things like, well, a term T in this language refers to an object O if and only if T is the name Willard and O is Willard, or T is the name Scott and O is Scott, and so on. And also replacing ordinary truth with Tarski truth over your language. I see this as these two theses as quite radical and having very far-reaching consequences. Now, you asked, I think, about the whole impact of those things and how they relate to T-schema truth theories or truth theories in general. And I myself find it fascinating that when the Davidsonian program burst on the scene in the 1960s and through the 1970s, Donald Davidson was Aquinian in a great many respects. Quine, of course, had been his teacher in graduate school, but he believed the doctrines that you've asked about. And what he did, or at least what he saw, the way he saw his project initially, is that Quine was skeptical about meaning, right? He was not going to accept the ordinary notion of meaning. And so Davidson develops a theory of meaning which doesn't itself posit meanings. And in fact, it doesn't use the vocabulary means that. It doesn't use the notion of meaning at all. It uses two notions. It uses truth and reference. But what did he say about those notions? He said that in truth and meaning, he says the notion of truth he was employing was simply Tarski's. And of course, Quine accepted that. And what did he say about reference? He said it doesn't, as he uses it, the notion of reference, as he uses it in his truth theories, doesn't stand for any relationship between linguistic expressions and the world. Now, it certainly doesn't stand for our ordinary notion of reference. And its only function, the only function of those axioms in a Davidsonian truth theory that specify the reference of individual words and phrases is to serve as connections about how the different sentences of the object language get their truth conditions assigned. So what their function is simply to connect the contents of the claims that S1 is true if and only if so-and-so, and S2 is true if and only if such and such, and so on. And this was expressed by Davidson in rather language is not always easy to understand. And he talked about a kind of holistic conception. And the idea was that if you knew a truth theory of the sort he developed, if you knew a truth theory for an object language, then you would not only know all of the T sentences that the truth theory derives, but you would know how the derivation of any one of those sentences was connected to the derivation of every other sentence in the language. You would know an interconnected system, the end results of which were the various assignments of truth conditions. And that's what he thought made it plausible to suppose that if you knew one of his truth theories, you would understand the language. And that was the excuse for calling these truth theories theories of meaning for the language, even though there's nothing in the theory that uses meaning or any notion coming close to it. So you could be a Quinian, which was a very powerful position historically at that time, and to be a Davidsonian and still have empirical theories of meaning, even, Davidson thought, even empirical theories of meaning which have interesting, he thought, philosophical consequences, as he indicates in various places, including on the very idea of a conceptual scheme. Now, so how does that all fit together? The Quinean indeterminacy and the truth theories functioning as theories of meaning in such a way as Davidson hoped to make them compatible with the Quinean doctrines. Not well. Again, the point I made a little bit earlier about Tarski was one that Davidson hadn't at that time appreciated, and that is, if the Davidsonian truth theories were really taken to employ Tarski's conception of truth, then knowing what was stated by a Davidsonian truth theory would supply you with no information whatsoever about the meanings of any sentences in the language. And so, of course, that would be a failure. Eventually, Davidson came to see this and came to regard truth as a primitive. Indeed, I think he had in mind our ordinary notion of sentential truth. And then when you do that, his theories would give you some information about meaning. But as John Foster and others showed in the 70s, they don't give you nearly enough. Not nearly enough. And Davidson himself, to his credit, recognized this and did a kind of recasting of how one might think about the relationship between these axiomatized truth theories and the claim that they can play the role of additive meaning. And he came up with another criterion. That, too, was shown to fail, and there were quite a few other attempts which tried to strengthen the condition that you have to bear some certain relationship to this. You have to know something about this truth theory, and if you do, then you're going to understand the language, and that means that the truth theory can play the role of a theory of meaning. And this is something I've written about a lot. Some other people have too. My conclusion is none of those approaches worked, and they can't work. Now, so that's kind of the history of at least one prominent way of putting Quine together with some of this truth material. But another thing that I want to mention is that if I'm right about how to interpret Quine's doctrines, and in particular, if I'm right that they lead to Illuminativism about our ordinary notions of meaning and reference and and a predicate being true of a given thing, and indeed even our ordinary notion of truth, and giving up propositions, and doing everything with Tarski truth in one's present language, and Tarski reference in one's present language, then I believe the Quinean arguments become self-defeating. The Quinean arguments for the two, the indeterminacy and the inscrutability theses. And in the end, I think what they really rely on, and I'm going to put this very crudely, is a pair of premises, if you will. One is a way of thinking about physicalism, and we can put it by saying all genuine truths are determined by the physical truths. And then there's an indeterminacy thesis. Physical truths don't determine ordinary meaning or ordinary reference or what have you. That's, roughly speaking, what the Quinean premises what Quine's arguments require, but I used the notion of physical truths in those statements. And the physical part is truths of a spruced up version of our contemporary physics. It's the only thing it can mean. And calling them true is just calling them Tarski true. And if we accept the conclusion of Quine's argument, and if you restate the premises that way, you get all Tarski truths of my present language, including the truth that I'm talking to you now, and that I own a computer, and that I have an automobile, and all of that, are determined by the truths of some spruced up version of my present language of physics. Well, that's just not very plausible. I mean, imagine somebody who had articulated that theory 300 years ago when our physics wasn't nearly as developed as it is now. Nobody would give that the slightest chance of being correct. And anybody who says that about the past has got to think, look, I doubt that we have in our present physical language now all the concepts needed to do the relevant determinations. And that means that either physicalism, as Quine appeals to it in the argument, appeals to some of the very notions that he ends up eliminating, in which case the premise is gone, or the premises don't do the work that needs to be done in the argument. And we could say a similar thing about the indeterminacy thesis. Physical truths don't determine so-and-so. That becomes completely uninteresting. Okay, so I don't know if I answered what you were thinking about when you asked the question.
You answered precisely. It's exactly down the line I was thinking of, so I do really appreciate that. The next question I wanted to ask was, what was the impact of naming and necessity on formalized languages?
Well, the impact of naming and necessity was not so much, I think, on formalized languages as it was just on our thought about language and related issues. I guess to start with what you are asking about and then move to a little broader canvas, Kripke in the late 50s and early 60s developed his model theory for modal logic, which then was quickly taken up and gave us possible world semantics as understood by Montague and Hans Kamp and David Kaplan and a variety of other people. And I think a sort of key element of that whole thing and the uses to which that formal apparatus was put had to do with the way those formalisms were interpreted, the way his semantic frameworks were interpreted. And the key notion was the notion of necessity. And there was nothing so much really in the purely formal development of that semantic framework, which kind of told you what the interpretation of necessity was. And that's a little bit unfortunate and something that had to be corrected, because necessity had been thought of by both its friends and enemies, by both the Carnaps and Marcuses on the one side and the Quineans on the other, had been thought of, well, yes, necessity and analyticity, they're all more or less just two different names of the same thing. They're basically linguistic concepts. And so long as they were thought of as linguistic concepts, some of Quine's long-standing objections to them would remain in force, I believe. And that means Kripke's formal work, so long as those remained in force, could simply be seen as a kind of mathematical exploration that, yes, I guess we can assign some sort of interpretation to the box and the diamond and so on as they occur in modal logic. But the question was, what sort of interpretation was it going to be?
Yeah.
What is it really going to mean? What's it going to relate to? And naming and necessity, probably more than anything else, was the work which, in a very intuitive and informal way, tried to indicate that what was being talked about were simply, I'll put it this way, counterfactual conditions on objects being so-and-so. What is nowadays called metaphysical necessity. And without naming a necessity, it's much less clear what all that formal work would have amounted to. And it was particularly important, of course, for Soule to clearly distinguish a priori from metaphysical necessity, to give cogent arguments that there are statements that are metaphysically necessary but not knowable a priori, and to give, I think, not quite as cogent but still in the end defensible arguments that there are statements that are contingent but knowable a priori, and to make it quite clear that neither of these two notions, which don't coincide, is to be identified with linguistic necessity or analyticity. So these were enormous developments in analytic philosophy, and they were really the death knell for the conception of philosophy, which had been popular in some quarters for a number of decades, that philosophy was just a matter of conceptual analysis, which was at bottom simply linguistic analysis or analysis of meaning. And the philosophy that we've seen since naming and necessity appeared in the early 70s has moved quite far away from those earlier paradigms. Now, I don't know what I may have left out. I guess one of the things I've left out is the naming part of the naming and necessity. And even though Soule himself never wholeheartedly embraced Millianism, his work led to severe criticisms of descriptive theories of names and natural kind terms. And it led to a revival of Millianism about names and an extension of that point of view to natural kind terms. And I would say to a recognition that meaning is neither transparent to the agent nor internalist. It's determined in part by things that go well beyond the agent himself or herself. So I guess those are the main things.
Yes, yeah. You extended the theory a bit yourself, didn't you? Could you briefly run me through some of your results?
Well, I'll try.
Yeah.
There's really kind of two stages in this, and there's a stage that covers up until about 2010, and then there's a stage since then.
Yeah.
In the earlier stage, my friend and one-time colleague Nathan Salmon and I both endorsed Millionism about proper names as a semantic theory, even though at the time Saul remained agnostic about that. And I defended that. Nathan had a little bit different way of defending it than I did, and one of the things that I concentrated on was I tried to articulate some mechanisms by which contextually relevant information in surrounding a particular use of language is added to the strictly semantic content encoded by the sentence that's being used to arrive at propositions that are asserted and believed. And then, because these propositions that are asserted and believed and get communicated are the things we really focus on when we're using language, try to explain why, if we think of semantic content as merely a kind of starting point for this process and not the ending point, then we no longer have a compelling reason to suppose that ordinary speakers should be seen as highly reliable authorities about what information is in fact linguistically encoded by a given sentence. The thought being, what we need as speakers is we need to be able to identify what's asserted and believed and communicated. And we need to be pretty good at that. We don't want a theory which says that we're systematically mistaken about that. To the extent that we attribute lots and lots of mistakes about that to ordinary speakers, it makes our theory more and more questionable, because if there were too many mistakes, we wouldn't be as competent and effective communicators as we are. So that was an important fact, and the idea that I had there was that even sentences which don't contain indexicals, different uses of those sentences on different occasions convey lots of different meaning over and above their purely linguistically encoded meaning, and we should think about, as a first approximation, what the linguistically encoded meaning is the kind of least common denominator, which is more or less, not exactly always, more or less always there. And there's no reason speakers have to know about that, and they don't. And also, I mean, when you think about instances of Frege's puzzle, the thing is, if contextual information is added to what's asserted and communicated, and even what's believed, then you can have uses of two sentences which differ only in terms, million terms, which designate the same thing, and they're going to give rise to different, not the same, assertions being made and different beliefs being expressed. And so you can account for some Fregean intuitions about these things. Now, so that was one of my projects. Now, another thing I worked pretty hard on was trying to sort of articulate a little fuller picture of Kripke's distinction between metaphysical and epistemic possibility, and to give a kind of principled account of how you can just generate all sorts of instances of the necessary a posteriori, and I then, it kind of led naturally to looking at people like David Chalmers and Frank Jackson, who wanted to take this, what I thought was a fundamental advance in philosophy, which corrected a lot of old and but persistent philosophical mistake, namely the idea that one and the same statement or proposition can be metaphysically necessary, but epistemically not necessary, epistemically knowable only a posteriori. And I think in the history of analytic philosophy, failure to recognize that has been the source of a lot of mistakes. But Chalmers and Jackson were very wedded to the idea that, no, there's only one kind of possibility. And these things, which had been called instances of the necessary a posteriori, are really cases of sentences which are associated with two propositions, one of which we evaluate when we're asked whether they're necessary, and another that we evaluate when we are asked whether we believe them. And I tried to argue that you couldn't make that work or that go. And Bob Stalnaker had a version of that too. The difference was he had a kind of pragmatic account of how this is supposed to happen, whereas Jackson and Chalmers seem to be suggesting a more straightforwardly semantic account. It's sometimes called two-dimensional semantics. And then one of the things I still tried to do during that stage was to correct some of Kripke's own discussions in lectures 2 and 3 of Naming and Necessity, having to do with a certain puzzle that he articulates at a certain point. And the puzzle has to do with a challenge to the idea that any statement can be both necessary and knowable only a posteriori, because, as Kripke puts it in Naming and Necessity, well, if it's knowable only a posteriori, then prior to investigation, it could have turned out otherwise. I mean, after all, why is investigation needed? Investigation is needed because, and this is what you're inclined to think, to rule out the possibility that it's false. But if it's a necessary truth, there are no possibilities when it's false, in which it's false. Therefore, the objection goes, there just cannot be any statement which is both necessarily true and knowable only a posteriori. And Kripke gives a very inadequate answer to that in Lecture 3 of Naming and Necessity. And he basically says, oh yeah, well, it's necessary, all right. It's true in all possible world states. But when we take it to be a posteriori, what we're doing is we are evaluating the epistemic situation of somebody who, at perhaps a different possible world state, is in an epistemic situation that's qualitatively identical to ours. And in the end, what that really means is we've got two sets of possible world states we're thinking about. The one, such that, okay, the original thing is always true, assigns truth to every world state, and the other, one which assigns falsity to some world states depending on how things qualitatively appear. And this was the birth, this is how two-dimensionalist semantics got started, and I try to show in some of my work that Saul's discussion of those points is incorrect, and then the whole business at the end of his objection to mind-body identity. I don't. It's not that I'm an advocate of mind-body identity. It's just that the argument he gives is based on failing to account for the true nature of the necessary a posteriori. So that was the first little bit of stuff that I did in response to naming and necessity. Now, I said there were two parts of it. My more recent work, I have a theory of propositions that I started developing in 2010, and I'm continuing to work on, and my most recent book was in 2015 on that. And I have a view of propositions as cognitive act types. And an example, predicating being a philosopher of Saul Kripke. This is something we can do. And I wanted to say that when we do that, we represent Saul as being a certain way. And if he is that way, then what we did, namely perform this act, the act that we performed represents him as being that way. And that act, which is a proposition, it's a purely representational cognitive act type. That act is true because it represents something in a certain way, and the thing it represents is that way. And you can extend this to complex propositions as well. Now, once you go down this road and you start thinking of propositions in this way, then one of the nice things that just happens right away is you ask yourself, what's the difference? What is it for a sentence to express a proposition? And hence to be true if the proposition is true. What is this mysterious expressing relation? That's one thing. The other thing that we've never known about propositions is, what is this mysterious entertaining relation? Propositions are supposed to have this feature. They're supposed to represent things as being a certain way. And then when we entertain the proposition, we thereby represent the things being that way. What is this relation of entertainment? And it's not just that we do it. Any cognitive agent that has thoughts or that represents the world has got to be seen as doing. What is this relation? Well, if propositions are cognitive acts of a certain sort, the entertainment is a relation that everybody already recognizes. It's the relation of performing that holds between an agent and an act type. So if you ask the question, why does an agent who entertains a certain proposition represent something as being a certain way? The answer is the same as the answer you get if you ask, why does an agent who performs the act of jumping jump? There's just no mystery there at all. And moreover, it's not a relation that requires a whole bunch of cognitive apparatus. All sorts of very simple organisms can do this too. Okay, so anyway, that's part of the theory of propositions. But what is this expressing relation? Well, just think of the example I gave you, predicating being a philosopher of Saul Kripke. I can do that in a variety of ways. I can look at him and think he's a philosopher. But another way I can do it is simply use the sentence. I can simply say, Saul Kripke is a philosopher. So, and people can do that who've never met Saul Kripke, don't know much about him, and so on. That might be the only way that some people can do that. So what we want to say is that when you learn a language, what you do is you learn to use the sentences to perform the propositions that they express. And now we ask ourselves, what's the relationship between two cognitive acts? The act of predicating being a philosopher of Saul Kripke and the act of using the sentence, Saul Kripke is a philosopher, to predicate being a philosopher of Saul Kripke. Well, both of those acts represent Saul Kripke as being a philosopher, so their truth conditions are identical. But their entertainment conditions are different. You can perform the one act, namely predicating being a philosopher of Saul Kripke, without using any sentence. But the other act, in order to perform it, you've got to use that sentence. And if you do use that sentence, you perform the first, more abstract act as well. You're doing two things at once. So now we take both of these to be propositions. And we have two propositions that are representationally identical, but they impose different conditions on the minds that entertain them. And this automatically gives us a structure, a whole way of dealing with multiple aspects of Frege's puzzle. Aspects involving Hesperus and phosphorus, aspects involving water and H2O, examples of puzzles in which you use a name in one case and then there's some visual impression in another case, instances of Frege's puzzle involving first-person cognition of oneself, instances of Frege's puzzle involving present tense cognition of the present time versus some other kind of cognition of that time. And all of this falls out. All of these solutions to what had seemed to be difficult Frege's puzzle cases will fall out with no threat to Millionism whatsoever from the identity conditions of propositions as cognitive acts of representing things as being certain ways. The relationship that's important is this. It's like the relationship between traveling to work and driving to work. The destination is the same, but any instance of driving is an instance of traveling, but not vice versa. Once we see that the way in which propositions can be related can involve that kind of relationship, the solution space for traditional problems in the philosophy of language, including Frege's puzzle, in all its varieties, is greatly expanded. And this then gives you a way of dealing with what had always been the main objection to naming and necessity. Well, you say that descriptivism is false, but now aren't you saddled with Frege's puzzle with no possible solution? And the answer is no. We have some very powerful solutions. So that's the second part of it.
Very nice, very nice. The next question, it ties in. I wanted to ask you, is considering all that work you've done, and all the work on meaning and understanding and truth in general, do you think there's a possible way to make a coherent theory of truth? Do you think that will happen one day?
I do. I don't have it all worked out, and but I'll tell you the direction that I'm thinking, and I'll tell you some about work that other people are doing that I find intriguing. First, I think the theory of truth has to be located in the first instance, not with sentences, but with propositions, which are these cognitive things. Some of which are uses of sentences, but not all of them. Then once you've got the right conception of propositions, the basic idea behind the theory of truth is simple. If propositions are cognitive acts of representing things as being certain ways, then we can simply read off from the identity of the proposition how they represent things to be, and then truth is simply going to be, well, and the things are that way. That's the basic idea. Now, of course, to get a theory of truth for sentences, from this we're going to need a theory of propositions expressed by uses of sentences. Since in my new way of thinking of things, uses of sentences are themselves propositions, this, I think, turns out to be quite a bit easier than it has traditionally seemed. But now we get to the genuine hard problem, perhaps the hardest problem. And that is how to make all of this coherent in a way that avoids the liar paradox. Now, to get your mind around this, I want you to think of the way the liar paradox is presented by Tarski, or by people who are following in that line. So what we'll do is we'll start, and we'll write something down. Maybe we'll have a blackboard or a sheet of paper, and we'll put a numeral 1, and then we'll write following the numeral 1, sentence 1 is not true. Okay? And we all understand those words. Sentence 1 is not true. We know that's a genuine sentence of English. It's grammatically, it has the form of a sentence. And of course, sentence 1 is not true. That sentence type can be used to make true statements, because if I'd numbered some other sentence 1, I could use that very same sentence to say something true. So there's no question, that's a sentence. That's fine, that's perfectly legitimate sentence. And then we think, let's see now. Well, what if we consider this biconditional, the T-schema kind of thing? The sentence, quote, sentence 1 is not true, is true, if and only if sentence 1 is not true. And we're thinking, well, that's kind of confusing there. But geez, how can we possibly reject it? Because after all, we know this is a perfectly legitimate sentence, and this is simply an instance of the T-schema. Surely that's absolutely central to our notion of truth. How could that fail? I mean, it's biconditional. Could the right-hand side be false? Could the sentence be false, but the claim that it's true be true? No, of course not. Or the other way around? No, of course not. So we think, gosh, we can't reject that. And then we have one further step. And we say, well, what is sentence 1 anyway? And then we just look at the page again. And we say, oh, well, let's see. Sentence 1 is, and then we put it in quotes, sentence 1 is not true. Yeah, I mean, I can just see it there. Of course I can't deny that. And then it certainly seems to follow that sentence 1 is true if and only if sentence 1 is not true. And now we've got the liar. That's a contradiction. How can that possibly be? That's how it works with sentences. Now, how is it going to work with propositions? Let's start with some ways in which it wouldn't work. Suppose I said, okay, I want you to consider a proposition. This proposition is not true. And you're going to say, I don't think I really get that. In order to get that, I've got to know what the words this proposition refers to. It doesn't refer to just the sentence, just the syntax, just the string of words. What in the hell does it refer to? Unless you tell me that, I'm not so sure I've even got a proposition. And you say, well, okay. And so then the next thing you try is, well, okay, we're at a certain location. Let's call a given blackboard at our location place 1. And then what I'll do is write on the board the proposition expressed by the only sentence on the board in place 1 is not true. And so then you think, well, there you surely have a proposition, don't you? And you can surely identify it, can't you? Now, it's not quite so clear. And once we get there, we're going to be able to start recreating the problem, and we're in trouble again. But are we sure that sentence expresses a proposition? And are we sure that sentence expresses just one proposition? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't express just one proposition. Remember what I said about one of the earlier cases, Saul Kripke is a philosopher. That sentence, my use of that sentence actually expresses 2 propositions. One of it is the cognitive act of predicating being a philosopher of Saul Kripke, and the other is the cognitive act of using that sentence to perform that predication. Those are 2 different propositions, cognitively distinct, but representationally identical. And, once we go down this line and we develop this further, lots of times uses of a single sentence express many, many propositions. Many of them representationally identical, some of them not. But look, we're talking here about the proposition. What did I write down on the board? The proposition expressed by blah, blah. Well, there is no such thing. So now we haven't got a premise that's going to get us into difficulty. Now, it's not that we can't do more fiddling. We can do more fiddling. And we can get some more problematical, or at least candidates for giving us the proposition which is going to lead us to grief. I don't know how to rule out all of those candidates. But I know there are people working on this, and one of them is my colleague, Andrew Bacon, at USC, who's writing a book on this. And he's convinced that there are ways of doing this. And I think one of his advisors from Oxford, Kean Dorr, is convinced of this sort of thing as well. I have not seen the details of this. But I think there's a whole new domain here. Once we leave the well-trodden path of sentences as these strings of words being the primary objects of investigation, and look at what the true objects of investigation are, propositions, and come to a better understanding of what they are, I think we're going to have more options available to us. I cannot say for sure that we are going to be able to solve this problem, but I think there's plenty of room for explanation, and we may well solve it.
What do you think, in line with the same sort of subject, what do you think of the possible success of trading justification conditions for truth conditions in a given truth theory?
Well, this is getting a little bit out of my area. I think my gut feeling about this is that if we have a proper understanding of the bearers of truth and the notion of truth, many of the problems that have seemed to push us, or at least push some, in the direction of not speaking of truth conditions, but of trading them, as you say, for justification conditions, will go away. I think the pressure to make that sort of move has come from highly problematic ideas about truth and the bearers of truth and what it is for somebody to use a sentence to express a given truth bearer. Many of those ideas have been problematic. I think this is true, for example, if one thinks about certain accounts of what's going on with what is sometimes called, largely following Kripke perhaps, Wittgenstein's skeptical paradox about following a rule and his skeptical solution to that paradox. I don't think there's a single sort of coherent account of truth running through that, and different related notions that would justify making the move which dispensed with appeal to truth conditions. There's plenty of truth in certain aspects of the skeptical solution to the skeptical paradox, and these are truths that relate, which some people express by thinking in terms of justification conditions rather than truth conditions. But I don't think you have to do that.
Yeah. And very finally, but before I ask, I just wanted again to thank you for taking the time out. This has been really, really interesting and very informative. Normally people click off at the end, so I wanted to thank you before the final question.
Well, you're very welcome. It's enjoyable. These are interesting questions.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The final question would be, and you've covered some of this, so I just wanted you to expand a little bit. And which areas do you think look really promising when it comes to providing a truth theory? And also, what are the major problems? You've just ran me through some. Are there any more you can think of, let's say, concerning axiomatic theories, bringing in deflationism, or maybe even Tarski's undefinability theory?
I would like to think there's a lot of work going on in each of those different areas, and I really don't feel that I can give a very well-informed answer about their prospects. I would like to think that we've been making this problem or this set of problems too hard for a long time. And that I would like to think that one of the reasons we've been doing that is because we have known in our hearts that sentences are not the key things. They're downstream from the real things we want to investigate. They're not irrelevant, and they're important because they're public and they connect us to other people, which provides us with cognitive connections with other people that are very important. But they're not the real things. And the real things, we've just been treating them as if they're ghostly, we know not whats. And we simply haven't taken the foundational metaphysical or epistemic questions about these things seriously. And where I'm putting my hopes is on tying together new foundational accounts of the things that are asserted and believed and known, or true and false or contradictory or whatever. Foundational accounts, tying those together with the genuine problems that have been holding us up in having to do with hyperintentionality and theories of meaning, or having to do with the paradoxes, and not just the liar paradox, paradoxes involving vagueness. I think there's a whole, the Sorites paradox is one of the things I'm working on a little bit. And I think the idea that we are throwing into the air, when we use language, clouds of propositions, not single isolated ones. It's going to transform the way we think about these problems. That's my guess.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, as I've said, thank you very much for the time, Professor Soames. I really do appreciate it.
Okay, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It was a pleasure too. You have a really nice day. Thank you very much. Thank you.